My truck almost didn't make it out of the driveway that morning, and if you'd asked me then whether a rusty clipboard and a faded HOA letter could change everything I thought I knew about my little town, I'd have laughed and handed you a coffee. But 3 hours later, after a tow rope, a sheriff's cruiser, and more shouting than I thought a cul-de-sac could hold, my life looked different. That's the short version. If you've got time, I'll tell you the long one, the one with the dented tailgate, the forged paperwork, and the woman who swore she was protecting the neighborhood, even as everything she touched fell apart. I grew up on that truck. Not literally, of course, but if you're asking about sentimental attachments, well, you can't explain the smell of old oil and warm vinyl to somebody who didn't learn to fix things with his father on a Saturday morning. My name's Ethan Mercer, and the truck, a 1979 Chevy Stepside, belonged to my dad before me. He rebuilt that thing from a heap of metal and a handful of stubbornness. My wife calls it my shrine. I call it something else on the days it splutters and refuses to start. Either way, when someone tries to take it, I don't do nothing. The day started ordinary. The sun had that brittle fall light, the kind that makes everything look like it's on the edge between crisp and cold. I'd been standing by the tailgate, wiping coffee off my jeans, deciding whether to take the truck down to the repair shop or the junkyard, same two options I wrestle with every year. That's when I heard the heavy knock, the one that carries itself across lawns and tells you the person on the other side knows their rights and your face. Mr. Mercer, she called, sharp, precise, like a woman who'd spent a lot of time correcting other people. Her voice had a clipped, beyond-time quality. She wore a beige blazer that had once been expensive but had learned to worry about corners. She introduced herself as Veronica Hale, which meant nothing to me until later, because the first time you meet someone who's about to change your life, they usually come dressed like they already have. You need to move this vehicle. It's in violation of Section 12.4, she said, tapping a clipboard with a finger that had nail polish so pale it was almost nothing. Someone else pulled up behind her, an old tow truck with no logo, license plates that looked like the kind you could buy off the internet if you were trying not to be traced. The driver climbed out and smiled like he'd done this before. His name was Ricky. His smile was a practice thing. His hands greasy, steady, told the rest of the story. I laughed, because what else do you do when someone cites an HOA code at you over your own driveway? Veronica, right? I don't think the HOA can tow my personal property without a certified notice, and I'm acting under delegated authority, she said, as if someone had passed her a cape and a seal at breakfast. You've been given notice. You can't keep a vehicle that's in violation of community guidelines. She slid a photocopied paper across the clipboard, and the pen clicked like the final sound before a verdict. I don't remember the exact words I used, only that they tried to be reasonable and probably failed. Gentle questions about who on the board signed the notice, where the certified mail record was, whether the towing company was licensed. I asked things because I wanted desperately for this to be one of those misunderstandings, one of those stories where neighbors read a letter and get embarrassed, and then bake a pie and apologize. Ricky squinted at the paper and just shrugged. We got a call, he said. We're doing the tow. Neighbors started to gather. There's a weird alchemy to a front yard dispute. Privacy melts and curiosity coagulates into a cluster of faces by the sidewalk. Lena across the street came out in her robe, hair in a knot, eyes like she'd smelled smoke. She'd always been the kind of neighbor who saw things and did something, not a hero, just someone who noticed. She leaned on the mailbox and didn't interrupt. People took phones from pockets, because if there's one modern truth, it's that nobody believes a front yard physics until the phone confirms it. You don't have the authority, I said. I never received a notice. This truck is on my property. Your property is a common area, Veronica snapped. At 2 feet beyond the curb, it constitutes a right-of-way. The board has received multiple complaints. We are within our rights to remove vehicles interfering with community safety. That was when my neighbor Dan came out from his driveway, running a hand through hair that had surrendered to sleep. Dan is the kind of guy who drives with the hatchback open because he trusts people. He squinted at Veronica, then at the tow truck, and then at the photocopied notice. Veronica, he began. You haven't been on the board in months. There's a certain electricity that goes through a crowd when the name of authority is questioned in public. It was like someone walked into a room and started asking whether gravity actually still applied. Veronica's face tightened. For a second, she looked like the same woman who signs minutes and enforces guest parking. But then something clicked. Impatience replaced civility. You don't get to decide that, she said, voice low. I have the discretion. I will have this vehicle removed. That's when I turned the phone on. I didn't care much about viral clips or being right on the internet. I turned it on because my hands trembled and because history had taught me that an impartial recording makes liars hesitate. I hit record. I put the phone on the hood. The angle caught her insistence. The tow truck, the papers. Recording felt like a small armor. Ricky came up to the bumper, chain clinking over metal like the sound of a small gallows. Step back, sir, he said. We're authorized. I asked, again, to see the documentation I'd be taken to court over. I asked for the name of the towing company, the dispatcher, the HOA board resolution numbers. The answer was paper and shallow eyes. Veronica produced a form with a seal that looked official until you squinted hard enough to notice the date stamp had been pasted in with a crooked stamp, and the signature looked off. It was in that moment, small and stupid and obvious, that the tow driver hesitated. Not because he had a moral awakening, but because he noticed something others full of urgency don't always see, the wrong shape of a signature. He tapped the paper. Ricky looked back at Veronica and said, quiet. This doesn't look right. She stepped forward like a woman who had trained herself to fill space with authority. You're causing a disturbance, she told him. You're delaying what's necessary. If you do not comply, I will have you removed too. Dan crossed the lawn and got between Ricky and the chain. We're calling the sheriff, he said. He didn't have to ask. It was a kinetic decision. Someone dialed. Someone else described what was happening. The world sometimes behaves like a small town with a sheriff who knows your face. Other times it behaves like a machine with a telephone operator. Today it leaned toward the former. The sheriff arrived in a way that made the cul-de-sac hush. A pair of lights and the smell of coffee on the deputy's breath. Sheriff Tommy Graves is the kind of man who wears his badge like a reminder to himself rather than a weapon. He listened more than he spoke, and he has a face like his job has taken away his taste for nonsense. He asked for documents, he asked for names, and he looked at Veronica with the question that tilts authority on its head. Are you the one who called us? She said she was acting on behalf of the HOA. Sheriff Graves asked to speak to the board president. Veronica's answer drifted like something that should be proof, but wasn't. I don't have to do that, she said. That's when the deputy asked for the papers that established her authority to order a tow. Veronica handed over a thick folder that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and Sharpies. Sheriff Graves opened it, and his eyebrows curved the way a man does when a story is getting interesting. There was a certified letter in there, sure, but the mailing receipt didn't match the postmark, and the signature on the board resolution was a looped flourish that said everything without honesty. You got this in the mail? He asked me. No, I said. I would have signed for it, Sheriff. He scanned the room for an HOA board representative. The Real board president, a woman named June, had to be called in. June arrived, hair in a tight bun, expression like she'd been fighting fires for a living and telling jokes to them. She carried a binder that said Ridgeview Community Association in neat black letters. She looked at Veronica with the kind of confusion people get when you show them a fake painting and asked them to appreciate the brush strokes. No one authorized a tow, June said. Not in my name. Not in the board's name. Who are you? Veronica stammered in a way that would be comical if not for the gravity of the chain already snaking under a bumper. She spoke about delegated responsibilities, about interim committees, about safety and neighborhood blight. It became clear, with a light that sharpened like a blade, that something else was going on. June flipped through her own minutes and pulled up the board's most recent vote. The numbers didn't match. The dates were wrong. The signature, the one Veronica had presented as authorization, belonged to a board member who was on vacation 3 states away and who swore under oath in front of the deputy that he'd never signed anything like that. You can hear a lot of things when you stand in the quiet after a forgery is revealed. People shuffle shoes, someone curses under their breath, another voice says, I knew something was off about her. There's a kind of relief that's also like the air leaving a blown balloon. You're glad the pressure's gone, but you miss that inflated certainty. Sheriff Graves took Veronica aside. He did it with a kind of patience that's practiced for a man who has cuffed more people than he cares to count. He asked her where she'd gotten the document. She muttered about past authority, about how she still cared for the neighborhood. Then she said something that made my blood run slow. We were doing the community a favor, she said. People complain, nothing gets done, I took action. On paper, taking action can look noble. In practice, it can be an old woman sharpening a blade for reasons you only come to understand when the blade slips. Veronica had been a force on the board years ago. She had friends, influence, and a habit of turning small slights into long campaigns. To her, vehicles were more than metal. They were symbols of disorder. To me, mine was my father's work. To the sheriff, paperwork without provenance was a crime. The motives stacked like old boxes: resentment, a bruised sense of power, a willingness to skirt legality. They searched the tow truck. That was where the second surprise hit. The plates were stolen from another county. The tow company name on the dash was a shell, and in the glove compartment were photocopies of dozens of HOA notices, each one with slight variations, some with postmarks, some without. Ricky shrugged, said he'd been paid in cash, and the deputy wrote all of it down. There's something about watching a person's empire crack that's equal parts sorrow and satisfaction. Veronica's face sagged like a house when the foundation gives. She protested, said she'd been helping residents who couldn't get the board to act. It's a story I've heard 1,000 times in 1,000 forms. The person who lost an election, or who felt ignored, who decided to act outside the rules because the rules were slow and they were right. That's not a defense in court, but it explains the human part of why people do reckless things. The sheriff didn't arrest her that day. He didn't need to, but he did put a warning on the tow, called the registered owner of the plates, and told Ricky to back off. He took my statement, he took June's, and he took raining murmurs from neighbors who had been watching with their phones like bowls for truth. We gathered after the deputy drove away, like a town meeting without a chair. People told their versions. The woman who'd complained about a neighbor's truck 3 months ago, the guy who'd been ticketed for an overlong camper, the kids who'd seen Veronica on the phone with someone about tow schedules. Out of small pieces, a picture formed, a network, maybe not vast, but organized enough to look like negligence masquerading as protection. There were payments made to Ricky through a money app, small sums that didn't match invoices. There were fake forms. There was, most importantly, a sense among certain people that someone had been playing HOA enforcement like a game, and the rules were only for other people. That night we sat on tailgates and talked about neighbors and entitlement, about the strange power dynamics of homeowner associations, about how something as small as a lawn sign can become an ideological battleground. June called an emergency board meeting and invited anyone who wanted to show up. We filled the community hall with folding chairs and too much coffee. In the meeting, things got loud and honest in a way community meetings rarely allow. People came forward with stories of Veronica's campaigns to clean up driveways, of notices left on windshields, of pressure to fine residents for minor infractions. Some people admired her for taking initiative. Others felt targeted, humiliated by letters that suggested they were bad neighbors. There's always a paradox in civic life. The person who sees themselves as the guardian is sometimes the one who forgets the guardianship has rules. June proposed a simple thing that cuts through a lot of hillside politics: transparency. Make every towing order, every enforcement document, every fine, public and auditable. Create a single point of contact, no delegated authority without board approval. Strengthen the signature verification and require certified mail for notices. The room hummed with approval. It felt like moving from fog to a clearing where you can see the trees for once. Veronica didn't come to that meeting. Instead, she sent a note that read like a speech, full of righteous words and appeals to tradition. That's when more evidence came to light. Someone had been recording conversations with residents, adding commentary to notices, and even creating fake minutes of meetings to justify enforcement. People felt betrayed by someone who'd once been trusted. You can be the kind of person who believes in order and control without being cruel. The line between firm and abusive can be thin if you're not paying attention. Weeks passed. Sheriff Graves turned his attention to the tow network and discovered that Ricky wasn't just a lone operator. He was part of a small ring of independent tow drivers who'd been doing work for people who wanted fast results and didn't bother with the paperwork. Some of those drivers were unscrupulous. Some were just desperate. It turned into a tangled web of bad incentives: residents who wanted quick enforcement, a former board member who liked the power, drivers who liked cash, and an HOA structure that hadn't anticipated a person using it as a personal hammer. Months later, there was a hearing. Veronica pleaded guilty to a handful of charges: forging HOA documents, misrepresentation, and conspiracy to commit theft by deception. The judge gave her community service, restitution, and a ban from participating in HOA enforcement activities. It was one of those legal endings that leaves everyone feeling simultaneously satisfied and unsettled. Justice had been served in a narrow sense, but the larger questions about neighborly conduct and the temptation of power stayed. And then something strange happened. The story, once private and small, got a life of its own. People posted clips of the confrontation: the clip where I set the phone on the hood, where Veronica's voice wavered and the conversation broadened. Comments flew about HOA overreach, about the moral hazards of vigilantism by way of bylaws, about how a clipboard can be a weapon if you put the authority behind it. There were the expected trolls, people who thought we were making mountains out of molehills, and the unexpected allies, small communities 3 states away, who sent notes. We had a similar thing happen. It was like a small tree dropping a seed into the wind. The wind carried it places I didn't expect. People asked me whether I felt vindicated. I felt complicated. Vindication is a tidy word. Real emotions are layered. I was relieved the truck was safe. I was grateful for the sheriff. I was proud of neighbors like Lena and Dan who stepped forward. But I also felt sorrow for Veronica in a way that makes people uncomfortable to admit: sorrow for someone who'd been cornered by their own bitterness into stealing other people's peace. That's not forgiveness. It's just a recognition that people break for reasons, often small and persistent, and sometimes they take the rest of us with them. What did we change? We rewrote parts of the bylaws. We required multi-signatures for enforcement, clear channels for complaints, and penalties for residents who misused authority. We set up a transparency portal: everything filed in public, every towing request logged with timestamps and proof of certified mail. The immediate fix was mechanical. The lasting change was cultural. People had a conversation about how easy it is to let power calcify into privilege, and about how small communities need mechanisms to keep tempers and egos in check. There was an odd, quiet moment a few months after the dust settled: a Sunday afternoon when I was tinkering with the Chevy's carburetor, and an elderly couple from down the street stopped by with lemon bars. They'd been on the HOA years ago and had seen the comings and goings. "We let one person do too much," the woman said, handing me a plate. "We were tired, and we figured she cared." Her voice told me that not all blame sits on one woman's shoulders. We had, in a way, all outsourced responsibility to whoever seemed willing to take it. That realization has a bitter aftertaste. I think about small injustices differently now. When someone shows up at your door with a document and a firm tone, it's tempting to bow, to make a show of compliance because conflict is exhausting. What I learned is that a little vigilance, a phone on the hood, a neighbor willing to call out a lie can change the outcome. The real victory was quieter: neighbors who used their voices, a sheriff who knew how to ask the right questions, and a community that decided to make the rules less convenient for bullies. I kept the truck, sure. I still take it to the repair shop like a man who loves an old habit. But more than that, I learned to recognize how easy it is to let someone else's zeal become your shared problem. People ask me sometimes, when they see the clip online, what would you do if it happened again? It's gut and habit and the knowledge that rules matter when people enforce them fairly. And for those who wonder whether community outrage online helps, it does, and it doesn't. The clip got attention. Attention catalyzed broader scrutiny of similar incidents. That scrutiny changed policies in other associations as well. But public shame can also combust lives. It's complicated. I prefer community accountability that fixes structures rather than merely burning people. You want correction, not spectacle. There are still cracks, of course. People who long for a tight, orderly street sometimes resent the idea of loosened enforcement. They want someone who'll sign off on a tow and make it happen. But the cost is high if that someone acts without transparency. Community is about negotiation, about tolerating small annoyances for the sake of shared life, rather than letting rules become a club for the self-righteous. One late evening, after the hearing and the changes and the folding chairs in the community hall, I walked by the mailbox and saw Veronica on her porch. She looked smaller than when we'd first met at my driveway, older than her years, carrying a bag of compost like penance. I waved. She didn't wave back. A week later, someone left an apology in the community bin, not a public admission, nothing theatrical, just an envelope with a note. I went too far. I'm sorry, it wasn't signed. That's where the story rests for me, imperfect, human, with gestures toward repair rather than dramatic redemption. It taught me to listen, too, to the people like Veronica who become harsh because they feel like their agency was stolen. Listening doesn't excuse harm, but it helps us design systems that don't make harm easy. Before I go, and if you made it this far, thanks for sticking around. I'll leave you with this. Communities are messy, and we will always disagree about grass lengths and paint choices and who parks where. The trick is to build rules that limit conflict and mechanisms that stop single people from turning bylaws into a personal vendetta. If you live in a neighborhood with an HOA, ask how enforcement works. Ask for transparency. Ask who's accountable. It's not glamorous, but it's how you protect what matters. Your home, your neighbor's dignity, and the simple pleasures of a Sunday morning without someone knocking on your door with a clipboard. If this story sparked anything in you, a memory of a petty neighbor, a triumph over bureaucracy, or a worry about an HOA gone off the rails, tell me in the comments. How would you handle an attempt to take something that matters to you? And if you're the type of neighbor who likes to keep order, maybe take a minute and think about how you'd use that power, because the best kind of leadership is one that invites the rest of us in, not one that leaves us locked out. Thanks for listening, and next time you see someone with a clipboard, maybe ask to see the stamp.